On a January morning in 1862, the house servants at Riverside Plantation in the South Carolina Low Country entered the guest quarters to do their morning cleaning. What they found made them scream and stumble backward in shock. Not a dead body, but something that plantation society considered worse than death itself. William, the plantation heir, only 21 years old, eldest son of Colonel James Preston Whitmore, was lying in the arms of Samuel, a 20-year-old slave who worked in the cotton fields. What shocked the entire county of Beaufort wasn't just the discovery. After all, whispered rumors about certain masters and their slaves had always existed. What left planters, ministers, and society matrons speechless was the decision Colonel Whitmore made when he arrived at that room, witnesses present, bullwhip in hand and fury in his eyes. That decision, pronounced loud enough for every slave, overseer, and neighboring planter to hear in the plantation yard, would forever change that family's fate and become legend for decades to come. But before you learn what the Colonel decided that January morning, there's something you need to understand about what really happened at Riverside Plantation in the months before. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments what country you're watching from. Tell us where you're watching from. What you're about to hear is what the history books tried to bury, a true story that happened in the heart of the South Carolina Low Country when the Confederacy was forming and slavery was law. This isn't fiction. These are documented facts from letters, plantation records, and testimonies that survived in regional families. November 1861. Riverside Plantation was one of the most prosperous properties in Beaufort County, with endless rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon like white clouds on earth. The heat was suffocating that spring afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above red clay and turns every breath into labor. Colonel James Preston Whitmore, at 58 years old, was everything expected of a Southern gentleman and planter. A severe man with white mustache and military bearing, he'd built his fortune through hard work, strategic marriages, and an iron fist over his slaves. He had 3 children, William, the 21-year-old heir, and 2 younger daughters, already married to neighboring planters. William had been educated at Charleston Academy, where he'd learned Latin, French, mathematics, and the refined manners of the Southern elite. He was a handsome young man with dark eyes and delicate manners that sometimes worried his father. The boy's got a poet's hands, not a planter's, the Colonel would tell his friends, always with a tone of poorly disguised disappointment. But he was his only son, his heir, the one who should inherit everything when he was gone. That November, the Colonel had decided it was time for William to learn the real work of the plantation. No more horseback rides through the cotton fields or philosophical conversations on the veranda. It was time for him to know the numbers, the necessary punishments, the hard decisions a slave master had to make. "You'll accompany the overseer this week," the Colonel ordered one morning. "You need to understand how we maintain order here. A plantation doesn't prosper through kindness, son." William obeyed, but his heart was heavy. He'd always avoided going to the slave quarters, always looked away when he saw punishments at the whipping post. There was something in him, a sensitivity he himself didn't understand, that made him nauseated at the sight of others suffering. It was during one of those learning rounds that William first saw Samuel. Samuel was 20 years old and had worked the cotton field since he was 7. His skin was dark as polished mahogany. His eyes held a rare spark of intelligence, and his hands, despite the calluses from hard labor, moved with strange delicacy when he tended the plants. There was something different about him. Maybe it was how he kept his posture straight even under the scorching sun, or how his lips moved silently, as if praying or reciting verses no one else could hear. "That's Samuel," the overseer said with contempt, "bought from the domestic trade 10 years back. Strong, but he's got this habit of looking thoughtful, been whipped more than once for daydreaming." William looked at Samuel and their eyes met for just a second, only a second, but it was enough for something to stir inside him, a curiosity, an unease, something he couldn't name. That night, William couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window looking toward the slave quarters, where small fires flickered in the darkness, and the distant sound of a mournful spiritual rose up to the big house. He didn't know it yet, but that 1 second glance would seal his fate forever. In the following weeks, William found excuses to spend more time in the cotton fields. He told his father he wanted to learn the work up close, observe the harvest, understand the rhythm of production. The Colonel was pleased. Finally, his son was showing interest in the family business. But the truth was different. William was fascinated by Samuel. He watched from a distance how he worked, how he moved with a grace that shouldn't exist in someone bent under the weight of bondage. He noticed that Samuel was different from the other slaves. He could read. One afternoon, William saw him drawing letters in the red clay with a stick, quickly erasing them when someone approached. "Where'd you learn that?" William asked one day, pretending to supervise the work but really looking for an excuse to talk. Samuel hesitated, surprised to be addressed directly by the colonel's son. "My mama knew her letters, young master. She was a house servant to a lady who taught her. Before she died, she passed it to me, but it's forbidden, I know." "I won't tell anyone," William said quickly, and there was something in his voice, an urgency, a complicity, that made Samuel look up and study him carefully. From that day on, a dangerous ritual was established. William began sneaking books to the old gin house, an abandoned place where they stored broken tools. He'd leave the books there, hidden under burlap sacks. Samuel, who was sometimes sent to fetch tools, would find them and read by stolen candlelight from the chapel. They never arranged this. It simply happened as if a silent language had established itself between them. William left Longfellow, Emerson, even translations of Lord Byron. Samuel read everything with ravenous hunger, then left small papers with his impressions, short phrases, thoughts about freedom, about pain, about the beauty of words that spoke of a world he'd never know. One night, William took a risk. He waited until everyone in the big house was asleep and went to the gin house. He knew Samuel would be there. He could see the faint candlelight through the crack in the door. When he entered, Samuel stood up startled, nearly knocking over the candle. "Young master, you can't be here. If the overseer—" "I need to know," William interrupted, his voice trembling. "I need to know what you think when you read, what these words mean to you." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. There was danger in this, mortal danger, but there was also something he recognized in William's eyes, a loneliness, a desperation to be understood. "When I read," Samuel said quietly, "I forget I'm a slave. For a few minutes, I'm just a man who thinks, who feels, who exists beyond this body they gave me." William felt something break inside him. "I want to forget who I am too." "But young master, you're free. You have everything. I have a life I didn't choose, a name I have to honor, expectations that suffocate me. I don't know what I saw in you, Samuel. Maybe something that's always been inside me and I never had the courage to recognize." The silence between them filled with something impossible to name. The air in the gin house was hot and thick, smelling of old wood and melted wax. Samuel took a step back. "Young master needs to go. This can't happen. If they find out—" But William moved closer, not with the authority of a master, but with the shyness of someone who for the first time in his life was being honest with himself. "I don't know what this feeling is. It has no name. But I know that when I look at you, for the first time in my life, I don't want to be someone else." Their hands touched. Just that, a touch. And it was as if the entire world collapsed and rebuilt itself at the same time. That night, in the gin house between shadows and the smell of earth, William and Samuel crossed a line neither of them could ever come back from. When William left, dawn already breaking, the candle had gone out, but something inside him, something that had been asleep for 21 years, had been lit forever. What he didn't know was that a shadow had been watching from the overseer's window, a shadow that had seen everything and would wait for the right moment to use that secret. For 3 months, William and Samuel lived in a parallel world, built in the cracks of Riverside Plantation. They met at the gin house whenever they could, always on the edge of danger, always knowing that one single mistake would mean the end of everything. William brought books. They talked about poetry, about the abolitionist ideals starting to gain strength in the northern cities. Samuel spoke of his impossible dreams, of learning medicine, of traveling, of living in a place where there were no chains. "If I could free you," William said one night, "I'd do it tomorrow, but my father would never allow it. He believes the world's order depends on this." "And what does young master believe?" William hesitated. "I believe this world is wrong, but I don't know how to change it alone." They were happy in a fragile, secret way. But happiness built on secrets always has an expiration date. Reverend Thomas Blackwell was Riverside Plantation's chaplain, a 50-year-old man who conducted services in the colonel's private chapel every Sunday. He was a conservative minister who preached obedience and saw slavery as part of the natural order established by God, but he was also observant. He noticed how William had changed, noticed the light in the young man's eyes, the restlessness, the way he'd slip out at night and return in secret. Reverend Blackwell knew well the signs of sin, After all, he'd spent decades hearing confessions. One January night in 1862, the Reverend decided to follow William. He saw when he left the big house through the back door, crossed the silent yard, and entered the gin house. He waited a few minutes and approached the window. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. William and Samuel were embracing, talking quietly, and the intimacy between them was undeniable. This wasn't the intimacy of master and slave. It was something much deeper, something that in the Reverend's eyes was an abomination. Reverend Blackwell pulled back, heart racing, torn between his duty to report and the gravity of what he'd just witnessed. He spent the entire night in vigil at the chapel, praying, asking for divine guidance. At dawn, he made his decision. He sought out Colonel Whitmore. "I need to speak with you privately, Colonel," the Reverend said, and there was something in his tone that made the Colonel immediately dismiss the house slaves setting the breakfast table. "What's happened, Reverend?" "It's about your son, Colonel. What I'm going to tell you is grave, very grave." The Colonel sat heavily. "Speak." "I saw William last night, at the gin house. He wasn't alone." "Who was with him?" The Reverend swallowed hard. "The slave Samuel. And what I saw is it wasn't a master giving orders to his slave, Colonel. It was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Colonel Whitmore's face lost all color. His hands gripped the chair arms so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Where is my son now?" "Sleeping, I imagine. He returned just before dawn." The Colonel stood, grabbed the bullwhip that always hung on the wall, the symbol of his authority, and climbed the stairs with heavy steps. He entered William's room without knocking. The young man woke, startled. "Father, get up now." Something in the tone made William obey immediately. He dressed, trembling, not understanding what was happening. "Come with me." The Colonel descended the stairs, crossed the house, walked out to the yard. William followed, heart pounding. The morning sun was already high and hot. Slaves worked in the nearby cotton fields. The overseer was talking with one of the drivers near the cotton house. "Bring the slave Samuel here now," the Colonel ordered. The overseer ran. Within minutes, Samuel was brought, confused and terrified. When he saw William and the bullwhip in the Colonel's hand, he understood immediately. The day they both feared had arrived. The Colonel stood in the center of the yard. His voice, when he spoke, was loud enough for everyone to hear. Slaves, overseers, the house servants peeking from the big house windows. "My son was found in the early hours with this slave. The Reverend witnessed it. You all know what that means." A murmur ran through those present. William felt his legs weaken. "Father, Silence." The Colonel raised the whip. For a moment, everyone thought he would flog his own son there, in front of everyone. But then something happened that no one expected. Before we continue, if you value stories like this being told, support the channel with a super thanks of up to $100. Every contribution allows me to keep researching and bringing narratives that were erased from official history. Can't contribute? Share it. There are people who desperately need to know they've always existed, that they're not the first, that they have ancestors who loved and resisted before them. Your share can change someone's life. Colonel James Preston Whitmore stood in the center of the yard, bullwhip in hand, looking alternately at his son and at Samuel. Everyone expected the explosion of fury, the shouting, the exemplary punishment that would serve as warning for the entire plantation. But the Colonel didn't shout. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled, and for that very reason, far more terrifying. "William, you have two choices. You can deny it. You can swear before God and all these witnesses that the Reverend lied, that there was nothing in that gin house but a master supervising his slave. If you do that, I'll have Samuel whipped to death for seduction and witchcraft, and you'll remain my son and my heir." William felt the world spin. He looked at Samuel, who had his eyes closed, resigned to his own end. "Or," the Colonel continued, "you can confirm it. You can admit what you did. And in that case, my decision will be different." "What decision, Father?" William managed to ask, his voice breaking. "If you admit it, I'll prove to everyone here that it wasn't Samuel who seduced you. It was you who chose to dishonor this name, this family, this plantation, and a man who makes such a choice doesn't deserve to inherit anything I've built." The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. William looked at his father, then at Samuel, then at all the faces around, terrified slaves, shocked overseers, the Reverend with his expression of moral disapproval. And then, for the first time in his life, William Preston Whitmore made a choice that was truly his own. "I won't deny it," he said, and his voice was steady. "It wasn't witchcraft. It wasn't seduction. It was something I chose. I don't fully understand what it is, I can't name it, but I know it was real. A collective gasp of shock ran through those present. Colonel Whitmore closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing physical pain. When he opened them again, he no longer looked at William as a father. He looked at him as if looking at a stranger. Then it's decided. He turned to the overseer. Release Samuel. He will not be punished. Everyone was shocked. The overseer hesitated. But Colonel, I said release him, the voice thundered. This slave is not at fault. It was my son, who chose degradation. Samuel was released, stumbling, unable to believe he was alive. The colonel then turned to William. He pulled from his own finger the family ring, a gold ring with the Whitmore crest, and threw it on the ground at his son's feet. You are no longer my heir. You are no longer my son. You no longer have rights to this family's name. William felt tears streaming but didn't lower his head. You'll leave this plantation today, the colonel continued, each word like a hammer blow. I'll take you to the train station in Beaufort. From there you'll go to Charleston. I have an acquaintance who runs a boarding house on King Street. He'll give you shelter for a few months, but only because I've paid in advance. After that, you're not my problem anymore. And Samuel? William dared to ask. Samuel stays here. He's my property, not yours. You've lost all rights to anything on this plantation. The colonel paused. But I won't be unjust. I won't punish a man who was merely the object of your perversion. He'll continue working, nothing more. William looked at Samuel one last time. Both their eyes met, and in them was a sadness so deep that words could never express it. The colonel turned to everyone present. Let this be a lesson. I will not tolerate deviancy on this plantation. My son is dead to me as of today. No one will speak his name in this house. No one will ask about him. Is that understood? A murmur of assent. Now get back to work. People dispersed slowly, still in shock. Reverend Blackwell approached the colonel. It was the right decision, my son. God will reward your moral firmness. The colonel didn't respond. He just stared at the horizon of cotton fields, where the sun beat down mercilessly. 2 hours later, William sat in the front seat of the carriage, with a small trunk containing only some clothes and the books he'd managed to grab. He didn't say goodbye to his mother, who'd locked herself in her room crying. He didn't say goodbye to his sisters. When the carriage began to move, William looked back one last time. He saw Samuel from a distance standing near the cotton house. Even from afar he could feel his gaze. And then the plantation fell behind, swallowed by the red dust of the road. Colonel Whitmore didn't say a word during the entire 4-hour journey to Beaufort. When they arrived at the train station, he handed William an envelope with some money. This will keep you alive a few months. After that, you'll have to find a way to support yourself. I don't know how. It's not my problem anymore. William took the envelope. Father, Don't call me that. You're no longer my son. The train whistle blew. William boarded without looking back, unable to bear seeing his father's eyes again. As the train began moving, carrying him away from everything he'd known, William pressed his head against the window and let the tears flow freely. He'd chosen truth. He'd chosen not to deny what he felt, and the price of that choice was everything he had. But strangely, beneath the pain, there was something he hadn't expected to feel. Relief. For the first time in his life, he wasn't lying to himself. Colonel James Preston Whitmore's decision in January 1862 spread through the South Carolina Low Country like wildfire through dry grass. In Charleston drawing rooms, on Beaufort verandas, at Savannah balls, it was the only topic of conversation. Some called the colonel a coward for not publicly punishing his son. Others, paradoxically, praised him for his moral rigidity. He'd sacrificed his own heir in the name of honor. The women whispered, at least he didn't kill anyone. Could have been much worse. The men speculated, they say the boy became a bohemian poet in Charleston. A disgrace. But the truth is, no one really knew what happened to William after he stepped off that train at Charleston's railroad depot. Years later, in 1875, 13 years after the incident, a young abolitionist lawyer was organizing a rally in downtown Charleston when he met a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed but simple, who introduced himself only as William. The man worked as a private tutor in literature and French. He taught children of merchants, doctors, people who wanted to educate their children but couldn't afford an expensive academy. During a conversation after the rally, while drinking coffee at a cafe on Meeting Street, William told his story, without giving names, without giving details that could identify him. But he told it. I was expelled from my family for loving who I shouldn't have, he said simply. I lost everything, name, money, future, but I gained something I'd never had before, The peace of not lying to myself. And the person you loved? The abolitionist asked. What happened to them? William looked out the window at the street traffic. We never saw each other again. I don't know if he's still alive, if he was sold, if he managed to get free, but I carry with me the certainty that those months were the only ones in my life when I was truly myself. The lawyer wrote this story in his diary, a diary that was found in the 1920s by his grandson, and which today is preserved at the South Carolina Historical Society. As for Samuel, there are only fragments of information. Riverside plantation records show he was sold in 1865 to a merchant from Savannah. After that, his trail disappears. There is, however, a story, impossible to confirm, but which circulated for decades among descendants of freedmen from that region. They say Samuel was purchased by an older gentleman who, in the final years before emancipation, began freeing his slaves in his will. Among them was a man named Samuel, who, once free, supposedly traveled to Charleston. Some say, and this is only legend, there's no proof, that he looked for William, that the two met one last time in 1888, a few months after emancipation. They say they embraced on a dock at the harbor, already old, already marked by life, and that William cried like a child. They say Samuel said only, "You chose truth, and I loved you for it." But that, as I said, is only what they tell. The real story was lost in the folds of time, like so many other love stories that the antebellum South didn't want to record. What is known for certain is this: Colonel Whitmore died in 1870, wealthy but bitter, never having seen his son again. In his will, he left the plantation to a nephew. He didn't mention William a single time. William died in 1902 at 61 years old of yellow fever. His obituary in the Charleston papers was tiny. Died, Mr. William Almeida, known educator of children. No mention of family, no mention of the past. He was buried in Magnolia Cemetery in a simple grave, no visitors, no flowers. But among his belongings, few and modest, they found a strange object, a small wooden carving, clearly made by non-professional hands. It depicted two birds in flight, very close, almost touching. On the base, carved with patience and care, were two initials, W and S. No one knew where that carving came from. No one asked. It was buried with him. And today, more than 150 years after that January morning in 1862, the story of the heir who was found with a slave from the quarters is still remembered in the South Carolina Lowcountry, not in history books, but in plantation conversations, in old family memories, in whispers about a love that defied all the rules. The colonel's decision shocked the county, but what William chose to do, admit it, own it, not deny, shocked far more. Because in a world built on lies, telling the truth is always the most revolutionary act. And you? Would you have the courage to love against the rules? Would you have the courage to choose truth even knowing you'd lose everything? Leave it in the comments. And remember, these stories need to be told, because every time we remember them, we prove that love existed, that it was real, that it wasn't erased. And if, after all this, you want to hear stories where feeling finds a different setting, far from the big house under open sky, I have another channel just with romances between cowboys. There the weight changes, but the intensity remains. The link is pinned in the first comment.